Hey guys, this is Vince Miller. I'm excited you're joining us. Today we are in the final chapter of the book of Ephesians, chapter 6. I think this book has had some great and excellent content for our current season in life. In fact, today's topic is when to stand up and when to stand down. So, before we dive in, do me a favor right now, please hit that subscribe button below so that you can get notified when new videos come out, either in this series or any other. As we start a new series, you're going to want to get notified and informed so that you don't miss out. Also, do me another favor. Head over to the website today at some point. That's beresolute.org, beresolute.org, and do two things for me while you're over there. First, sign up for the Men's Daily Devotional. I write one new every day for men just like you. They are always short, sweet, and to the point, and they are made for guys like you, so sign up today. Second, while you're over there, pick up some all-in gear, like the hat I'm wearing right now. Support our mission and message here, which is to do this. It's to live all in for Him who lived all in for us. So grab a shirt, grab a hat, sport it, share it with others. And if you want to snap a pic and share it with me over on Facebook, Instagram, or even right here, wherever you socially gather, I would greatly appreciate that. Now, with that, let's dive into Ephesians chapter 6, knowing when to stand up and when to stand down. We are living through an interesting season of life, right? There's a lot of tension in the world. So much so, it can be hard to know when we should stand up and when we should stand down. And I think this is a real dilemma, especially for Christians. I know many right now who feel compelled to stand up and speak up about their beliefs and convictions, and yet have not done so because of the great social, political, and maybe even economic costs. Yet we have so many biblical examples of men who stood up at just the right moment, whose actions forever changed the world. Men like Abraham and Moses and Noah and David and Daniel, just to name a few. Men who stood up and acted in faith, accepting the social, political, and economic costs for their faith. But we all know that sometimes when we muster the courage to stand up, we can end up doing so when we realize later we should have stood down. And this is because sometimes when we stand up, we end up standing between God and His will. And, well, we will all encounter this dilemma eventually. So how do we do it? How do we know when to stand up and when to stand down? Well, I think Paul has a fantastic answer in Ephesians chapter 6 with two key principles that we should adhere to when we choose to stand up. First, when you stand, always be obedient to God. Always be obedient to God. In the latter part of Ephesians chapter 5, through the end of chapter 6, Paul discusses this tension. It's a tension that we're all going to encounter within marriage, family, and even our work environments. As we know, each of these environments are prone to have a strain point, right? And Paul knows that there will be moments of tension and stress in every relationship. For example, he lays out three examples here. First, the tension that occurs between husband and wife when it comes to selfless love and humble respect. Second, the tension between parent and child when it comes to authority and obedience. And then third, the tension between owner and slave when it comes to leadership ethic and work ethic. For those of us who have lived through these moments, we know the tensions, and some of them are challenging. And it's hard to know when it's appropriate to stand up against an authority and when we should stand down and submit to that authority. For example, in our country, we display civil disobedience when a person feels morally obligated. Therefore, we are invited to stand up and to speak out when the democracy does things that undermine the tenets that the whole agreed to protect. But these acts must still be done lawfully to be defined as civil disobedience. And they must be done in three ways, I think, to be civil. They must be done for the right reason, in the right spirit, and by the right people. And this gets really tricky when the definition of law and lawful is contested itself. But in this section of Ephesians, Paul lays out the biblical order for relationships. This is because God has an order and a will, because he's the creator, designer, and Lord. Therefore, he has an order and a will for the institutions of like marriage and family and government and the church. And often we become resistant to the structure when someone within those structures acts immoral or oppressive. But the issue is not a problem with the structure. God's structure and order are good. The problem is human sin invades the structure, and therefore we think the people and sometimes the structure are bad. Just consider this example. Let's say someone in one of these God-given structures acts sinfully. At this point, we, the victim, who suffer under the evil actions of another, have to decide when to stand up and when to stand down against that injustice. And we have to do it without disregard to God's structure. And this can be challenging for a victim under the authority of another whose authority and actions or attitudes are sinful, immoral, and completely unfair. And it's at this moment our will begins to resist their will, and we encounter what we call a battle of wills. And the hope is that we can stand up appropriately, and the party in authority will give way to our considerations and their wrongdoing. But this doesn't always happen. The battle of wills will sometimes escalate out of control. And Paul knows this. Therefore, he gives us a few examples of what it looks like to be obedient to God when we take a stand. And I think his third example is genius because it's not regarding marriage and family, but a worldly system known to oppress people, slavery. Listen to what Paul says to slaves and masters in this section. He says this, "Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord, not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them. And stop your threatening, knowing that he who is both their master and yours in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him." Now, Paul suggests that there is a way to stand up even under oppressive systems, right? The way that we stand up is to obey earthly masters as if we are submitting to the rule of God. And Paul here invites the slave to remember their identity and position as slave of God, and that their first line of submission is to him. That they bend their will first to the Lord, master, and owner of all things. And then in submission to God, they stand up for what is right before God, which is to act in character as a man of God in their present situation. Now, an outsider might interpret this as standing down, unfortunately. But really, it's not. Even though it appears that way, it's really standing up for what God deems is right and righteous. And then Paul even pushes the slave to render their service with sincerity. Not like tongue-in-cheek, but to do it wholeheartedly, even in an oppressive system. In doing this, two things happen. First, we stand up with character. And second, we stand up to embrace God's will in our present situation. And I think this has tons of application to oppressive work environments. Because I know there are tons of Christian men out there right now working in an oppressive environment in your workplace. And if this is your present situation, I'm sorry for you. You right now are trying to figure out how to stand up. And Paul's answer is this: stand up by acting with character as if God is the boss, and then do it with sincerity, which could look like you're standing down. But remember, it's not standing down, it's actually standing up. But, and there is a tipping point here. But a tipping point we encounter it when a human authority demands obedience that would be considered an act of disobedience to God. And it's at this point we must follow the supreme will of God, and we should do this in a godly way. For example, consider Daniel, a key Old Testament figure. He was a slave in a very oppressive empire, and he had a moment where he was confronted with a decision. He had to choose either to be obedient to the will of the government or be obedient to the will of God. He chose to stand on the side of God, which meant he would stand against the law of the government, an act of actually civil disobedience. But he did this in a way that brought attention and glory to God. And there was a risk that went with this for him, punishment by death, because it was the Babylonian Empire after all. But as we know, God saved him and used this situation to bring about God's glory in a pagan country. Now, I think God gives us opportunities like this more than we realize. I actually think they happen all the time. For example, this happens in a moment when a teenager stands up for God and against peer pressure, or in moments where a wife stands up for God and against the abuse of a husband, or a moment where an employee stands up for God and against the compromise of Christian ethics, values, and beliefs. And I believe more of that's going to happen in our world. But our response is relatively simple. Be obedient to God in all situations at all times. But, another trifecta of buts, right? There's one added nuance. Sometimes, even when we stand up in obedience to God, change does not happen in the system, culture, or environment. It just doesn't happen. This is because systems are slow to change. For example, take slavery in our country. Many have stood up against slavery, even the ongoing issues of slavery and racism. But slavery, racism, and other oppressive issues were not abolished overnight. And this creates another real tension, which is sometimes we stand up and we speak up and it doesn't have an immediate effect. Sometimes the change we want is not immediate, and we can be tempted to act in our will to speed up the process. And this is the Christian burden, to continue to live godly and in godly character when immediate change does not happen because the world system refuses to be changed. Thus is the reason that Paul throws in this example of slavery. But the first point is this: when you stand, always, always, always be obedient to God. Second, when you stand against the right enemy. Now, in the latter part of this chapter, Paul's going to remind us of something very important: the real issue. Paul clarifies that the real issue is not an issue with God's order or his structure or his will. The issue is not political, it's not social, and it's not economic. And finally, and this is super important, the real issue is also not a struggle with people. And this is important. And here's why. I know when I get it out into the world, I get confused about this. I can become convinced that people are the problem. I fall into the same trap that you fall into. I experience attitudes and actions and sin, and this draws my attention to people, so I fall for the illusion that my battle is with people. For example, when someone sends an angry email to me, or makes an accusation against me, or rips me apart, or even disappoints me, I see people. And because of this, I am tempted to go after them. But people are not the enemy, which means my boss is not my enemy, my wife is not my enemy, a political candidate is not my enemy, and a governor or a president is not my enemy. And I bet saying this bothers you a little bit, but listen to what Paul says. He says this: "For we do not wrestle against our flesh and blood, but against the rulers and against the authorities and against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." Did you hear that? Battle is not with flesh and blood. That's people. This means we as Christians need to view and define each moment of challenge a little different. We look at the issues of this life from a different perspective, a spiritual one. The battles we fight are not battles with people, but battles with spiritual forces and powers. And as we engage these spiritual forces and powers, the issues is really not about how to stand up or how to stand down, but rather how to stand firm. Listen to Ephesians 6, verse 13. It says, "Therefore, Take up the whole armor of God that you may be able to withstand in the evil day, and having done all, to stand firm. And following this, Paul spends a great deal of time talking about the armor of God and draws a picture of a man girded and ready for battle in the same way, fellas. We need to be ready for battle, not by going to war with people, but by seeing the battle for what it really is, a spiritual battle. This means as people who are often acclimated, right, and ready for a physical fight with another person, we need to reacclimate our vision to a spiritual battle with spiritual forces. And here's how I would do this the next time you feel compelled to stand up. Stop fixating on natural causes and seeing only natural issues. Look beyond this for a spiritual cause. For example, let's just consider this moment from the Old Testament. 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 15 through 16. This is a moment involving the prophet Elisha and his servant. Here's what it says. When the servant of the man of God, that's Elisha, rose early in the morning and went out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was all around the city. And the servant said to Elisha, "Alas, my master, what shall we do?" Elisha said, "Do not be afraid, for those who are with us are more than those who are with them." Then Elisha prayed and said, "O Lord, please open his eyes that he may see." So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw, and behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha. You know, fellas, I love this moment. This moment illustrates so beautifully what we sometimes miss because we're fixated on the wrong things. Elisha, a man of God, was attuned to the spiritual reality and therefore had tremendous peace. On the other hand, his servant was fixated on the physical issues, therefore responds in fear. But then a transformational moment. A prayer, sight was offered, followed by peace given to a man who can now stand firm. Do you see that? Firm. Gentlemen, take off those spiritual blinders and trade them in for some spiritual lenses and glasses and spectacles, and see the world not as physical, requiring physical solutions. Instead, see the world spiritually in need of spiritual men like you with spiritual responses, guiding others to spiritual solutions provided by only the Spirit of God. And this is how we stand firm. So fellas, stand firm this week. Man, I love you guys. I really have appreciated this study with you. Hit that subscribe button below, and I'll see you right back here next time. Until then, live all in for Him who lived all in for you.